All right, welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're going to deconstruct the system behind one of the most impactful and, let's face it, controversial figures of our time. And look, we're not going to just rehash his life story. No, we're going deeper, trying to understand the actual operating system that drives his almost unbelievable outcomes.
Okay, so let's just dive right in. And to start, we really have to get our heads around the sheer scale of what makes him such an outlier. It's so easy to get lost in the day-to-day headlines and forget just how different his achievements are, even when you compare him to other legendary founders.
So, the book we're looking at today frames him in a really unique way, not just as a CEO, but as this kind of composite figure. Imagine taking the insane, never-quit intensity of someone like David Goggins, combining it with the outside-the-box, first-principles brilliance of a physicist like Richard Feynman, and the grand strategic genius of a leader like Napoleon. That combination, that starts to paint a picture of why he's such a singular force.
So that brings us to the big question, right? How does one person do all of that? And the answer isn't just, oh, he's lucky or he's a genius. The source we're digging into argues that there's an actual system behind it all, an operating system, if you will. And while it's crazy demanding, it's something that can be understood. So what is it?
So, where do we find the key to unlock this system? Well, you're not going to find it in some standard biography that just lists events in his life. No, the source here is a book that acts more like a jigsaw puzzle, piecing together a direct look into his mind.
See, this book we're talking about, the Book of Elon, it's not a story about him. It's more like a manual built from him. The author literally sifted through millions of his own words, from interviews, emails, late-night tweets, you name it, and pieced it all together to build a guide to his core principles.
And the whole point was to create something that feels like he's mentoring you directly. It's a collection of his most timeless, useful ideas. So you or anyone can take these core concepts and actually think about how to apply them.
All right, so now that we know what it is, what's actually in this operating system? Well, the source breaks it all down into two huge fundamental pillars.
Okay, on the one hand, you've got the blueprint. This is the how. It's the tactics, the obsession with manufacturing, the way he cracks the code of a business. The famous example is SpaceX, right? Instead of just buying a rocket for $60 million, he asks a much simpler question. What's a rocket made of? And it turns out the raw materials were only like 2% of that cost. So what does he do? He says, fine, we'll build it ourselves. That, right there, is the blueprint in action. But then, on the other hand, you have the purpose. This is the why. This is about the mission, the philosophy, and his answer to what he sees as a modern crisis of meaning.
Okay, but let's be real. We've all heard the stories, right? That he can be, well, a pretty tough boss, an intense guy to work for. So how does that prickly reputation fit into this whole system?
Well, the way this source explains it is that we should try to reframe that. It's not about being difficult just for the sake of it. It's about prioritizing the mission, this grand vision for humanity, above everything else. And that includes, the feelings or comfort of the person standing right in front of him. It's a really tough concept, but it's absolutely central to his whole operating system.
And this quote right here, it perfectly captures the result of that mindset. You hear this about leaders like Musk and Steve Jobs all the time, right? They held people to a standard that those people didn't even think was possible for themselves. And by doing that, they pushed their teams to achieve things that pretty much everyone else thought was impossible. So that brings up another question. What on earth fuels that kind of intensity? Where does that absolute all-consuming focus come from? According to the source, it's a powerful duality in his motivation.
The book breaks it down into two kinds of fuel that he's burning at the same time. You've got clean fuel, that's him running towards a huge, inspiring mission for all of us. But then there's the dirty fuel, and that's him running from a really, really painful past.
And believe me, that dirty fuel is incredibly powerful. The source describes a pretty traumatic childhood in South Africa. I mean, he was beaten by a gang so badly he ended up in the hospital. And then his own father would verbally abuse him for hours on end, calling him useless and stupid. And that installed this deep, deep fear, a lifelong demon really, of being useless. A fear that he has been running from his entire life. And that combination, that's what's so rare and so potent. He's literally running away from his own personal demons while at the very same time running towards saving humanity. And if you really want to understand what drives him, you have to understand that duality.
Okay, so here's the really crucial takeaway from all of this. The point of breaking down his system isn't just to understand one guy. It's about creating a blueprint that other people can potentially use to go out and solve really big problems.
In fact, the stated goal of the book is pretty incredible:
to inspire 1 million new builders and entrepreneurs to go tackle the biggest challenges our civilization faces. And the way to think about Musk in all this is like the first person to run a 4-minute mile. You know the story, right? For the longest time, everyone thought it was physically impossible. But the second one person did it, boom. All of a sudden, lots of people could do it because the mental barrier was broken. He showed the world that yes, it is possible to build these massive trillion-dollar manufacturing companies from nothing. He broke that barrier.
And that really leaves us with a big, provocative question that his whole operating system forces us to think about. To solve our biggest problems, the really huge civilization-level challenges, what are we willing to sacrifice? If this kind of intense, relentless focus on the mission over the individual is what it takes, what's the trade-off we're willing to make? Thanks for joining us for this explainer.